They call me the last boulevardier because when I am not making a film, I sit in Parisian cafes and watch the world go by. I watch people, the way they move and interact with each other. They become characters. I listen for their accents and the rhythm of their speech. In my mind, I am writing my next film. I am often accused of rewriting history. I simply use historical events to tell stories about people. If history is written by the winners, who's to say that my interpretation is any less accurate than what has been previously reported, no? And who is more qualified to tell stories about France than I, Sacha Guitry, whose family has lived here for nearly 1,000 years? I have been fortunate in my great success and grateful to assist those around me, even those who scorned me. In my 7 decades, I have chased my dreams and lots of women, and got most of them. I married 5 times. I loved my father's dear friend, the inimitable Sarah Bernhardt, and I came to love the theater through her. Sunday visits and holiday dinners with Madame Sarah are fond memories. Among my happiest days of my childhood were my father. We had an adventure when he absconded with me for a short time on the pretext of taking me out for sweets. We were having Sunday dinner, and he announced that we needed to go to a candy shop. He bundled me into a carriage. We passed by one sweet shop after another, and as we passed each one, I cried, "Papa! Papa! There it is!" And he replied, "There's a better one down the road." The next thing I knew, we were at the train station with people rushing around with trunks. I was whisked into a compartment and covered up by a blanket. I spent the next several months with my father in Russia while he was on tour. I dressed up in costumes and performed scenes for my father's amused friends, for I learned that my father played for a living. And I knew someday I would do the same. My maternal grandfather, René Depongis, had notified the police at the border, and we were eventually found out. C'est la vie, no? When my brother Jean and I were young, we didn't appreciate my grandfather's accomplishments as a best-selling and award-winning novelist or stories of his adventures as a world traveler. My grandfather spoke in the exaggerated fashion, so Jean and I assumed that he was making it all up. Many years later, I came across my grandfather's letters in a trunk and discovered that the stories were all true. It was then that I developed a great appreciation for history, artifacts, documents, letters. Anyway, I was forced to return to my mother. My parents, who already lived separately, divorced, and I was imprisoned in Catholic boarding schools. I was to face another prison later in life, but more about that later. I could never understand why we had to memorize facts and figures that were in our textbooks when we could simply look them up. Never have I been called upon in adult life to know the capital of remote regions or geometry. I was expelled from a dozen schools, as was Jean. It was customary in France at the turn of the century that when a pupil started a new school, he began in the first form. By attending so many schools, I never progressed past the first form. Let me tell you a story about another one of my close companions and my unlikely friendship with theater critic Paul Leoto. Among my plays is Petite Hollande, about a man who goes off to visit a Dutch girl. It ran for only 8 performances, but it was praised by Maurice Boussard, who went by the pen name of Paul Leoto, who wrote for the Mercure de France. Paul could be disagreeable, but he was the sort of man who would take a chicken leg off your plate without so much as asking. I also admire him for his love of animals. You may have noticed that I put my cat Musette on my album cover. Paul's parents abandoned him when he was a child, to be raised by an aunt. His closest friend was the family dog. His mother was an actress, as was mine. Paul would write to her, begging her to see him when she was not in town. When she did agree to meet with him at a railroad station, more often than not she didn't show up. Paul wrote about his relationship with his mother in the book Le Petit Ami, which was difficult to read because of its blunt realism. She once tried to seduce him. He never got over the incident. The great loves of Paul's life were animals, writing, and women. In that order. What Paul lacked in finesse with people, he more than made up for with animals. If there was a clash between a girlfriend and a cat, the woman had to go. He took notice of the many hungry dogs he encountered each night as he walked to the theater. His dream was to find a place for those starving dogs to live out their lives, frolicking in the country. He saved his francs, and in 1912 he bought a home outside the city in Fontenay-aux-Roses, where he realized his dream of creating an animal sanctuary. Their company made him happy. The company of women made me happy. The religious dogma of our school days did not stick. But I come from an era believing that if a respectable man intends to have sex with a respectable woman, he has an obligation to marry her, no? So I married all the women I loved. Lana, my 5th wife, is a good companion. I will stay with her for the rest of my days, if she will have me. My first marriage was to Charlotte Lisée. She was a charming actress with blonde hair, violet eyes. A few years older than myself. She taught me a great deal about acting. When I was called up for military duty for the 3rd time, the first 2 times I was rejected for health reasons, but the government kept trying. I was stationed outside of Paris. There was a provision allowing married men to remain near their wives and families, so I asked Charlotte, who lived in Paris, to marry me. This is where my acting skills came in handy. We tricked the local mayor into coming quickly to marry us, telling him I was a dying man. After the ceremony, the mayor quickly got over being duped and joined the celebration. I could then serve in Paris. Rheumatism eventually relieved me of my military duty. In Paris, we met the most creative people. A frequent guest of ours was this actress, Colette. Her first husband was Henri Gauthier-Villard, who came from a publishing family. He wrote racy novels and music criticism, using various pseudonyms. He shamelessly printed Colette's work under his own name. Henri took a mistress who soon took a fancy to Colette. Henri retreated and sought a divorce. Love triangles fascinate me and inform my work. I dedicated my play, Le Villiers de Nuit, a successful piece with a love triangle, to Octave Mirbeau. like Paul Mirbeau, was a theater critic. Ironically, his advice to me was, don't bother about criticism. I've been criticized for creating characters who were hedonistic, scoundrels, tricksters, and cheats. But they were both amusing and meant no harm. They were real. They simply exist for their own pleasure. Some critics accuse me of that. Don't tell Lana, but the great love of my life was my second wife, Yvonne Printemps. She was a beautiful young woman who had a voice like a songbird, a waif in Montmartre. She was my muse, and I wrote a number of roles for her. One of our greatest collaborations was my play Mozart. Renaud Hahn composed this score. Yvonne and I traveled to the U.S. together, and in 1929 we played on Broadway. I could not let her out of my sight. She had to be free. She left me for Pierre Laudenbach. You may know him as Pierre Fresnay. I cast him as her lover in my play about Franz Hals. Pierre's wife knew of their affair and revealed it to me. Shattered. I have not since then found such a deep connection to another woman. I consoled myself with the company of Jacqueline Delobach, who became my third wife and leading lady in film. And when she became tiresome, I went to Switzerland to keep company with Geneviève de Serreville. More than a 30-year age difference fanned the flames of my love for her. Once Geneviève declared that she had nothing to wear for dinner, I took delight in furnishing her with a new wardrobe, and then I felt obligated to provide all the jewelry and send all the trinkets to go with it. And to please her family, we were married in a church, conveniently located on the country estate I had recently purchased. On our honeymoon, Geneviève and I traveled and looked at great art in Amsterdam, which bored her terribly. Once we settled into domestic life, Geneviève grew despondent, packed her overflowing bags, and left me. I eased the pain of her departure with the company of Mariette, whom I installed in an apartment near Jacqueline. Mariette appreciated my clever humor and provided an attentive audience to listen to my plays. And then the war erupted. I donated proceeds from my plays and films to support those affected by the Nazi occupation. Films were produced as propaganda. I made my position clear by writing a book highlighting the roles of Jews played in the history of France, going back 500 years. Marshal Pétain warned me against having the book published because I could get in trouble with the government. I released the book anyway. And in attempting to divert the attention of government officials from my fellow actors, I was condemned for collaboration in Popular Life magazine. To my astonishment, I was arrested by the Committee of Liberation. I was dragged off and deposited in a chamber usually reserved for weddings. How ironic. Then I was thrown into a cell, then transferred to another cell, which I shared with the former Minister of Education and a former ambassador. My fellow prisoners included scholars, surgeons, journalists, and barristers. I was injured in the hands of the gods. I was soon transported to Drancy Prison, where I made the acquaintance of other playwrights and novelists. After a month, I was ushered in to face a committee. I was being held for dealing with the enemy, for which there was no evidence. The charge was changed to intelligence with the enemy. I was transferred to yet another prison to be interviewed by a magistrate who would decide if needed there was a case against me. My arrest was based on 5 accusations made by anonymous sources. The accusations against me were dropped and I was released. I wrote a book about the nightmare. began a romance with Arletty, but we were better suited as friends. She introduced me to Lana Marconi, a beautiful air of mystery. She and I shared an appreciation for the finer things, yes? Filmmaking fascinated me since my youth. One of my first projects was the film So de Chez Nous in 1914. I shot the first close-up in European film history with months of D.W. Griffith. My film starred my father Lucien Guitry, Sandra Bernhard, artistes Edgar Degas, Auguste Renoir, and Claude Monet, composer Saint-Saëns, and novelist Octave Mirbeau. I have never forgotten the opulence of the Russian palace. And now I have my own castle. My art collection, paintings, books, photographs. The gift of a letter signed by Delacroix began my obsession, grew to fill my home, which my father had built after a successful South American theater tour. Marble, glass, and exotic rugs fills the halls in the room. The time I have spent pursuing art has been surpassed only by the time I've spent pursuing women. I have no one to leave my collection to when I am gone. I have no heirs. Having no children has neither pleased nor disappointed me. My plays, my books, and my films